The mist, known locally as the Ha, had always been Ela MacLeod's favourite accessory to the village of Achnabreck. It wasn't the thick, suffocating fog of the cities, but a soft, ethereal shawl woven from the breath of the North Sea and the cold, damp stone of the Highlands, draped gracefully over the rolling landscape. In Achnabreck, where the cottages were built of dark granite and heather thatch, clustered tightly around the single winding cobble street that led down to the slate-grey waters of the loch, every morning felt like stepping into an ancient, whispered legend. The air, perpetually scented with peat smoke and wild gorse, held a quiet solemnity, a profound peace that Isla had always believed reflected the pure heart of the people who lived there. She had sought refuge in that peace, believing it offered an unbreakable sanctuary from the betrayals of the outside world, only to find the rot had rooted itself deepest right where the granite met the soil. It was in this deceptive tranquility that the constable, a good-natured man named Ewan, who had watched Isla and Callum grow up together, knocked on her cottage door 4 months after the Sunday lunch. The sight of him, formal and grim in his uniform, was a stark contrast to the brilliant, almost aggressively cheerful purple of the blooming heather on the moor behind her home. The hook, the moment that snagged the village's collective breath and pulled the curtain back on the MacLeod family's private drama, wasn't the sight of the 3 collapsing figures that Sunday, but this quiet, inevitable confrontation. The moment Isla, still wearing the mask of the dutiful, traumatized wife, realized the sanctuary she had sought and the life she had tried to erase were irrevocably gone. The small, close-knit beauty of Achnabreck was inescapable. It lay nestled in a steep valley, carved out by a long-gone glacier, where the slopes were covered in a tapestry of dark green bracken and golden-brown rushes. Above the village, a dramatic skyline of craggy peaks perpetually shrouded in swirling cloud dominated the horizon, providing a constant, magnificent backdrop to the trivialities of daily life. Even the rain, which fell with predictable regularity, was not unpleasant. It simply intensified the emerald tones of the moss-covered stone walls and made the loch gleam like polished obsidian. It was a postcard of Scottish perfection, a place where people left their doors unlocked and trust was the currency of survival. This atmosphere had been Isla's greatest weapon and her greatest weakness. It was where her anger had incubated, cold and hard as the granite bedrock, and it was where the local detective, familiar with the rhythm of quiet deceptions, would look first. The target had been her husband Callum and his parents Lachlan and Moira MacLeod. They were pillars of the community. Lachlan, a retired fisherman whose face was a roadmap of the North Sea's harsh winds, and Moira, the local baker whose shortbread was legendary, but whose eyes, Isla now saw, held a calculating chill she had long dismissed as maternal reserve. The perceived betrayal had been simple, devastating, and delivered by a seemingly innocent email snippet she found on a shared tablet. A cryptic message from Callum to an unknown recipient, discussing clandestine meetings and shared moments of indiscretion, followed by a panicked, deleted thread from Moira mentioning the need to keep this from Isla for her own good. The subsequent frantic searches revealed bank statements with large, erratic withdrawals and late-night calls he took outside in the rain. For 3 months, the suspicion festered, slowly poisoning the marriage like the arsenic she later sourced. She watched Callum with new eyes, interpreting his quiet exhaustion and increased distance not as the stress of his work designing fishing gear, but as the guilt of a man leading a double life. When she confronted Moira, the older woman had merely offered a tight, unsettling smile and a non-committal response about Callum being under pressure, a response that Isla instantly logged as complicity, a shared family secret designed to protect their precious son while she, the outsider, was left to look foolish. Lachlan, she recalled, had simply looked away, his granite face betraying a flicker of shame she interpreted as confirmation. In the beautiful, honest silence of Achnabreck, Isla felt utterly isolated, the victim of a conspiracy waged by the very people who were supposed to be her family. The sheer rage, not just at Callum's perceived infidelity, but at the parental hypocrisy, had solidified her decision. She wouldn't just leave, she would cleanse the stain. The setting for the execution was the MacLeod family cottage, nestled near the loch shore, its stone walls covered in climbing roses, whose late summer blooms provided a final, poignant splash of color. The Sunday lunch tradition was sacred: roasted lamb, potatoes dripping with butter, and the required element of a dessert brought by Isla. This particular Sunday she had spent the morning baking a perfect sticky toffee pudding. The aroma, rich with dates, brown sugar and treacle, filled her own small kitchen, a smell of domestic comfort that masked the bitter reality of the finely ground white powder she had carefully folded into the batter. The MacLeod kitchen was warm and filled with the comfortable clatter of generations of cooking. Isla moved with a cold, almost surgical precision, her every gesture calibrated for kindness. She praised Moira's lamb, listened attentively to Lachlan's long-winded tale about a stubborn engine, and even held Callum's hand across the table, offering him a look of deep, sorrowful affection, a masterful performance of a wife clinging to the last vestiges of a dying love. "It looks beautiful, Isla," Moira commented, admiring the pudding's deep caramel sheen as Isla presented it. "You're spoiling us." "Only the best for Sunday," Isla replied, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She sliced 4 perfect portions. Lachlan, always keen on pudding, took the first bite, followed closely by Moira. Callum, distracted by a text message, she noted the quick frown and the immediate pocketing of the phone, took his spoon a moment later. The atmosphere was quiet for a minute, filled only by the gentle clinking of cutlery on ceramic. They ate the pudding slowly, savoring the rich, gooey sweetness. It was a poison delivery system perfected by generations of Scottish baking. Then, Isla's moment arrived. She placed her fork down, pushing her barely touched portion away. "Oh, I completely forgot. I promised Mrs. Campbell I'd drop off that book she lent me. The library closed at 5 and I need to catch her before she settles in for the evening. I'll be back in 20 minutes. I just need to get the car." The slight protest from Moira was drowned out by a cough from Lachlan. Go on, dear. This pudding is, quite rich." She walked out swiftly, her heart pounding a dull, icy rhythm against her ribs. She didn't get into the car. Instead, she rounded the corner of the house where she could see the kitchen window without being seen herself, and waited. It was perhaps 30 seconds before she heard the sound. Not a scream, but a heavy wooden chair scraping violently back, followed by a sickening thud. A moment later, a strangled groan. Taking a deep, calculated breath, Isla rushed back in, tearing open the kitchen door with a dramatic gasp. "Oh my God! What happened?" The scene was chaos. Lachlan was slumped against the table, his face ashen, clutching his stomach. Moira was already on the floor, convulsing lightly, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Callum was on his knees, gripping the edge of the counter, sweat beading on his forehead, trying to heave himself up but failing. Isla's performance shifted instantly from betrayed wife to frantic rescuer. She was the one who shouted for the phone, the one who dialed the emergency services with shaking hands, real or feigned, she wasn't sure anymore. The one who knelt beside Moira, murmuring comforting nonsense while ensuring she kept her fingers well away from the woman's mouth. She wiped the sickly sweet, now tainted traces of pudding from the corners of Lachlan's mouth. She directed the paramedics when they finally arrived, a blur of neon and urgent voices disrupting the quiet Sunday calm of Achnabreck. She rode in the ambulance with Callum, holding his hand, whispering desperate prayers for his recovery, her conscience a blank, snowy field. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, whispered condolences, and relentless, agonizing waiting. Lachlan and Moira were in critical care. Callum, younger and stronger, recovered quickly, though the poisoning had left him weak and confused. Isla maintained the perfect vigil, the worried wife, the concerned daughter-in-law, even supplying the police with a helpful timeline and insisting the family had recently had a run-in with a troubled local youth. But Detective Inspector Fraser, a seasoned officer brought in from Inverness, wasn't buying the story of the troubled youth. He was a quiet man with the patient tenacity of a fisherman tracking a difficult tide. He noticed the minute details. Isla's hands were too steady when she poured water. Her grief seemed performative, lacking the ragged edges of genuine shock. He focused not on the people outside the home, but on the food that was consumed. The medical team had identified the compound as a highly toxic, slow-acting metallic poison, something complex not easily available. and certainly not something found in the pantry of a Scottish baker. The compound, traceable to certain obscure laboratory suppliers, was only in the pudding, and the pudding was made solely by Isla. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the police forensic analysis determined that Isla's portion, the one she had barely touched, had less than 10% of the toxic dose found in the other 3 slices. She hadn't eaten it because she didn't need to. Her excuse about the book drop-off had been timed perfectly to avoid the onset of symptoms, and the subsequent Socorro was just that, a flawless, self-serving distraction. The arrest was devastatingly quiet, carried out with professional deference by Ewan and D.I. Fraser. It was a cold, granite-hard morning when they led her away, the only witness being the distant, mournful cry of a seabird over the loch. She left Achnabreck, the village of perfect peace and treacherous secrets, realizing she was no better than the people she sought to punish, a prisoner of her own fierce, misguided fury. Callum, Moira and Lachlan survived, though their recovery was slow and marred by the deep trauma of the attack. It was only after Isla was formally charged, when the family was forced to confront the absolute devastation she had wrought, that the true, agonizing reason for her motive was dragged into the light. In the ensuing investigation, D.I. Fraser, still working the case to understand the root cause, discovered the deleted emails and the large bank withdrawals. But the recipient of the emails was not a lover. It was a private investigator specializing in financial fraud. The moments of indiscretion referred to secret meetings with the PI. The massive withdrawals were not gifts to a mistress, but desperate, large-scale payments to a loan shark. Lachlan MacLeod, the patriarch, had been secretly struggling with a crippling, decades-long gambling addiction that had recently ballooned into life-threatening debt, putting the family cottage and all their savings at risk. Callum had discovered the depth of the debt 6 months prior and had taken it upon himself to resolve it completely, working night and day, selling off assets and dealing with the shady lenders, a world Lachlan had been too ashamed to face. Moira's panicked, deleted thread about keeping things from Isla was the key. She hadn't wanted to keep the affair a secret. She had wanted to keep the debt a secret. Moira believed that if Isla knew the MacLeod fortune was gone, due to Lachlan's weakness, Isla would leave Callum, shattering his heart. They were protecting him from financial ruin and a broken marriage, not covering up infidelity. Lachlan's shamefaced glance that night wasn't guilt over Callum's cheating, but guilt over the destruction his addiction was inflicting on his son's life. Callum MacLeod, sitting in the hospital room, reading the cold police reports that laid bare his father's addiction and his own well-intentioned but tragically secretive efforts to save his family, finally understood the terrible symmetry of the disaster. His secrecy, born of loyalty and love for his wife, he hadn't wanted to burden her with the family shame, had been weaponized by her misinterpretation and distrust, turning their home into a chemical war zone. The revelation hit Achnabreck like a gale-force wind. The village, which prized trust above all, was stunned not by the poisoning but by the shame of Lachlan's secret. Isla was tried. Her defense argued temporary insanity driven by perceived spousal and parental betrayal. She was convicted, but due to the complex, non-fatal nature of the crime and the psychological stress she endured, the sentence was tempered. Years later, the MacLeods were still in Achnabreck. The cottage, cleaned of its ghostly remnants, stood firm against the wind. Lachlan was in recovery, his secret finally exposed, and the heavy burden lifted by the consequences. Moira, chastened by the near-death experience, learned the value of honest vulnerability over self-sacrificing secrecy. And Callum, having visited Isla repeatedly during her sentence, never losing sight of the fact that her crime was an act of terrible, desperate love fueled by a tragic misunderstanding of his own secretive devotion, learned the deepest lesson of all, that silence, even when rooted in good intentions, is often the most destructive lie of all. When Isla was finally released, she did not return to the MacLeod cottage immediately. She went to the farthest reaches of Achnabreck, high up on the moor where the heather was thickest, and stood on the rough ground watching the Har roll in. She hadn't expected to see anyone, but Callum was there, waiting, his face aged by the intervening years, but his eyes still clear. He didn't offer a hug or an apology for the debt he hadn't created. He simply offered his hand. "It's a good day for the gorse to bloom," he said, looking over the magnificent, unbroken landscape of their home. She took his hand. "It's a better day for the truth to bloom," she replied. The journey back to Achnabreck would be long, filled with quiet, difficult conversations and the immense labor of rebuilding trust from the ashes of betrayal and poison. But they would walk it together. In the quiet resilience of the Scottish village, in the strength of the granite walls that had witnessed both beauty and tragedy, they would find their happy ending, founded not on perfect peace, but on the imperfect, hard-won understanding that love requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to step out of the mist and into the painful light of day. They survived the poison. They now had to survive the cure. This was the real MacLeod legacy. The tragedy that unfolded in the deceptively quaint Scottish village of Achnabreck, shrouded in its ethereal and treacherous ha, was never truly about the poison in the dessert. It was, at its very core, about the silent venom of assumption and the catastrophic failure of marital dialogue. Like the village itself, Isla and Callum's marriage appeared outwardly perfect, as solid as the granite, as welcoming as the hearth fire, and as transparent as the loch water on a clear day. Yet beneath that idyllic surface, the vital channel of mutual communication was utterly clogged. Trust, the bedrock of any union, is not an immutable stone. It is a muscle that demands constant, vulnerable exercise. When Isla encountered those fragmented emails and erratic bank movements, she did not approach Callum with the frankness that love requires. Instead, her mind, already weakened by the stress of life and the emotional distance Callum's secrecy had carved out, filled those painful gaps with the worst possible scenario: infidelity. She constructed a lethal reality from breadcrumbs of information. Because the mutual trust was so threadbare, it collapsed under the weight of a simple suspicion. The act of turning the sanctity of a Sunday lunch and the symbol of nourishment, the sticky toffee pudding, into a deadly weapon was only possible because dialogue, the most essential tool for a couple's survival, was already dead. The food became the weapon because the voice had fallen silent. Callum, conversely, committed the classic and destructive mistake of misplaced kindness. His silence, motivated by protective love and the shame of exposing his father's profound weakness, was an act of self-sacrifice. He genuinely believed that by absorbing the burden of Lauchlan's debt alone and conducting secret meetings with financial investigators, he was shielding Isla from unnecessary pain. He chose the isolation of secrecy over the vulnerability of truth. Yet a secret, no matter how well intended, manifests to the partner as distance and deception. The practical result was the same as if he were actually cheating. Isla felt excluded, lied to, and betrayed by her in-laws. His fear of losing her over a financial problem ultimately almost cost everyone their lives and, ironically, ensured the destruction of the very trust he sought to preserve. In Achnabreck, with its majestic mountains and air of immutability, silence often signifies peace. But in human relationships, silence is frequently a minefield. The grim lesson that emerged from that Scottish kitchen, when the lives of 3 people were jeopardized by a sweet dish, is timeless. Before allowing assumptions to harden into destructive certainties, before reaching for a weapon or planning an escape, the only true defense and the only way to preserve the sanctuary of a home is the brutal, honest courage to speak, to confront, to ask, and to listen, even when the truth is difficult and shameful. Love, even the deepest kind, cannot survive where dialogue has died. The attempted murder in the Scottish village was the desperate, final scream of a marriage where words had long since ceased to be exchanged, and the survival of the MacLeod family and their eventual reconciliation hinges on the promise that, going forward, they will never again let fear or shame speak louder than shared truth.